My name is Elaine Springgay. I'm the Forestry Officer for Forests and Water at FAO, based at our headquarters in Rome, Italy. I've been asked to talk about forests and water and policy, primarily at the international level, but I'll also discuss a little on national policies. Before I begin, I would like to compliment the presentations of colleagues and briefly share with you some of the key messages we share with decision makers to advocate for the importance for forests and water. It's estimated that 80% of the global population live in areas where water resources are insecure, albeit lack of infrastructure, seasonality, etc. And according to the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment, forested watersheds and wetlands supply 75% of our accessible fresh water. But as our populations become increasingly urbanized and grow steadily, it's important to note that at least 1/3 of our world's largest cities, or hundreds of millions of people, rely on protected forested areas for a significant proportion of their drinking water. And many more people are reliant on water from forested watersheds that are not formally in protected status. And one study had even found that for every $1 invested in watershed protection can save upwards of $200 in water treatment facilities. Despite these figures, the Forest Resource Assessment 2015 reports that only 25% of the world's forests have soil and water conservation as their main objective. But the forest and water topic is not new to the international agenda. In fact, FAO has been quite active for some time in a process that is referred to the Forest and Water Agenda, a process of meetings and activities to promote the importance for forests and water. And this actually started with the Shiga Declaration on Forests and Water in 2002. And since then, there have been several meetings discussing forest and water topic. And most recently, the latest milestone was in September of 2015, right before the launch of the Sustainable Development Goals. And this milestone was the International Forest and Water Dialogue at the World Forestry Congress in Durban, South Africa. And FAO has actually gone so far as to summarize what has come out of these meetings in the publication Forests and Water International Momentum in Action, which you can access using the link on the right. And what we found was that in the period of 2002-2013, the recommendations of these meetings were rather consistent. The first major recommendation being that we need to improve our understanding of forest-water interactions in the face of climate change for different scales and various forest types, and that we need to be better at communicating this research to decision makers and practitioners, which is something the publication that has inspired this virtual webinar has really taken leaps and bounds to do. In addition to improve understanding, we need to take a more integrative landscape approach. And referring again to the publication, we need to look beyond the traditional watershed scale, but that a landscape approach may be even looking at national, regional, and continental scales. And that in order to do this, we need collaborative partnerships that cross sectors. We need capacity building at regional, national, and local scales or levels. We need improved monitoring systems. And that perhaps with this, we are then able to evaluate forest and water relationships as well as develop intersectoral policies. while these meetings and recommendations are necessary, it's equally important that they get implemented, which is precisely why several partners, including FAO, ICRAF, IUFRO, and INBAR, developed and launched the 5-year Forest and Water Action Plan at the World Forestry Congress in Durban in 2015. The action plan emphasizes a need to integrate science, policy, and practice, where science can be implemented on the ground in real-life situations, and that together these can inform adaptive policies that further encourage research and adaptive practices. Therefore, the Forest and Water Action Plan has 4 major goals related to science, policy, practice, and 1 cross-cutting goal on capacity building and communication. But what does this mean for countries? What is the current situation? There are about 24 countries where forest and water management are housed within the same ministry. However, generally we find that these remain as silos, and forest and water do not interact when it comes to policy. That does not mean that there aren't integrative policies in play, or practices for that matter. Generally speaking, in the Northern Hemisphere, Canada, US, and Russia, we see forest policies and practices that take water into consideration. But this is also true in the Southern Hemisphere. For example, Chile last year launched their latest forest policy, and there is a very strong component looking at forest management for water supply. Similarly, in Kenya, mountains and their ecosystems, including forests, are acknowledged as water towers supplying water to the rest of the country. However, when we see segregation of forests and water, this is problematic. A good example comes from the Philippines, where last year it was announced a large investment, over $120 million, was going to improve water supply infrastructure for the city. Around the same time, it was announced that the primary watershed delivering the majority of water to the city was under degradation because the forest guards employed to protect the watershed had gone on strike for lack of payment, and there was a sudden increase of illegal logging and slash and burn agriculture, which was affecting water quality from this watershed. So, and yet, none of the $120 million being invested in water supply infrastructure was being spent on the protection of the very source of the water supply. How can that be? You're investing in improving a water supply system, and yet the very source is reducing the quality of the water supply, which will more quickly degrade the new infrastructure system. And this is one of the major problems with separation of forest and water, not only in policy, but in practice. Another issue in policy is that there are certain forest and water narratives that are popular and quite pervasive in policy, even though they are not universally true. 4 major ones are: forests increase water yield, forests reduce floods, forests increase base flows, forests reduce erosion. But the truth is that these are context specific, and the converse can also be true. So long as the policy does not properly understand the context for which it's applied, we potentially see a problem. A good example, forest-reduced floods really depends on scale. The scale of the area we're talking about, the magnitude and duration of the precipitation event prior to the flood. You can plant as many trees as you want. You're not going to prevent flooding in the floodplains of Bangladesh. And yet we often see these policies that are mismatched for the context they're in. And this is why it is important to have science inform policy and for there to be on the ground understanding of the context for which these policies apply. So from a historic and current situation, we now move to the SDGs, which are quite new and still somewhat under development as the indicators are still being worked on as we speak. And there are two SDGs where forest-water relationships are explicitly acknowledged. SDG 6, Clean Water and Sanitation, and 15, Life on Land. There are also two other SDGs for which the forest and water topic can also relate, SDGs 12 and 13. Now, as previously mentioned by colleagues, the climate change agenda does not go beyond greenhouse gases, and therefore we still need to try and push the forest and water topic because it is incredibly important for climate change. But it is encouraging that within the INDCs, or commitments of countries to the climate change agenda, forest and water relationships are sometimes acknowledged. Special ecosystems such as mangroves and montane forests are explicitly mentioned for certain INDCs. So this is encouraging. But it is important to note that a lot of countries mention forest and water or these special ecosystems contingent on the availability of funding, meaning that they will only work on them if they receive funding from donors. On that note, I would like to look a little bit more closely at SDGs 6 and 15, for which there are three relevant targets, 6.4, 6.6, and 15.1. 6.4 looks at increased water use efficiency across all sectors, and the custodian agency for its indicator is FAO Aquastat. Hopefully what we will see in time is that the forestry sector becomes more water use efficient, particularly the planted forest industry. Targets 6.6 and 15.1 are actually very similar and plan on using similar methodology, mainly remote sensing, to measure progress. 6.6 is being led by UNEP in support with other agencies on behalf of UN Water. And 15.1, the custodian agency is FAO and will be using a forest resources assessment indicator. Both 6.6 and 15.1 are looking at changes in extent area of those ecosystems. And for 6.6, forests are recognized as a water-related ecosystem. Of course, things haven't been reported yet, and what will be very interesting is to see how changes in extent ecosystem then relate to water. The question is it possible to correlate changes in land use to changes in water supply? Will we be able to see that loss of forests or degradation of forests in a landscape does affect the extent of water that's within and coming out of these ecosystems. Hopefully this is something that we will see, and it will be very interesting to see how the self-reporting that will be done by countries, particularly for the Forest Resources Assessment indicator, how this potentially correlates to information being seen by third party conducting remote sensing studies. So what does policy need in order to include forests and water? In conclusion, we need to see policy based on science. We need to see more publications like the one that sparked this webinar to be produced and written in a way that it can reach practitioners and policymakers. We need to see a stronger interaction between science, policy, and practice, where all three can inform each other. We also need harmonization of trade-offs and synergies within policy frameworks. We need to better understand what are the win-win situations and how to avoid the lose-lose, and include these into adaptive policies. Lastly, we need to see institutional mechanisms and opportunities for dialogue in order to address potential conflict in policies, particularly policies from different sectors and cross-sectoral policies. So how do we do that? We need a stock-taking of international and national policies, and we need to build the capacity of decision makers and stakeholders in recognizing the importance of forests and water for climate, and how to implement practices and policies that will help to maintain these important environmental processes that help to regulate environments and, frankly, life on Earth. Thank you very much.